What happens when a calm Hollywood star walks into a live morning talk show, and the conversation slowly turns into an on-air clash that no one expected? Make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours, and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The studio of CBS Mornings is bright, polished, and full of that usual morning energy. The audience is seated, cameras are rolling, and everything feels normal on the surface. Today's guest is Matthew McConaughey, sitting comfortably with his signature, relaxed posture. Across from him is Gayle King, smiling warmly as the segment begins. Gayle opens with her usual welcoming tone. "Matthew, it's really good to have you here again. It's been a while." Matthew nods and smiles. "Good to be back. Always a good conversation here." The audience claps lightly. Everything seems smooth. Gayle continues, flipping through her note. "So, let's start with something people have been talking about online. You recently made comments about Hollywood and how it handles criticism and public pressure." Matthew leans slightly forward, still relaxed. "Yeah, I said people are reacting more than they're reflecting." Gayle tilts her head. "And some people felt that was you criticizing accountability culture." Matthew pauses for a second. "I think there's a difference between accountability and constant outrage." A few audience members react with soft murmurs. Gayle doesn't stop there. "But when you say that, don't you think it sounds like you're pushing back against being questioned?" Matthew shakes his head. "No, I'm pushing back against assumptions." The audience gets a small reaction. Some nods, some quiet laughter. Gayle leans forward slightly now. "Assumptions about you specifically or the industry?" Matthew looks at her directly. "Both. Because they're connected." There's a brief silence in the studio. One of the co-hosts shifts in their seat, sensing a shift in tone. Gayle continues, more focused now. "But Matthew, people online said your comments felt like you were dismissing serious conversations happening in Hollywood right now." Matthew exhales slowly. "Online conversations are not always serious conversations." That line gets a reaction from the audience, a mix of laughter and claps. Gayle smiles, but her tone tightens a little. "But they are conversations that involve real concerns." Matthew nods. "I agree. But not every concern is being discussed in good faith." The audience reacts again. Gayle raises her eyebrows slightly. "So you're saying criticism isn't always valid?" Matthew immediately responds. "I'm saying criticism and outrage are not the same thing." A noticeable shift happens in the room. The energy becomes more focused, less casual. Gayle glances at the camera for a moment, then back at Matthew. "That's a strong statement." Matthew smiles slightly. "It's an honest one." Gayle leans back in her chair. "But you understand why people might feel challenged by that." Matthew nods. "Of course. But feeling challenged doesn't automatically make something wrong." The audience reacts again, this time louder. One co-host quickly jumps in, trying to lighten it. Okay, I feel like we're already deep in the philosophy zone this morning." A small laugh spreads across the audience. Gayle smiles politely, but she keeps her focus on Matthew. "You've always been known for being calm, reflective, kind of above the noise. But lately, people feel like you're more frustrated." Matthew tilts his head slightly. "I'm not frustrated. I'm just more direct." Gayle responds instantly. "That sounds like frustration to some people." Matthew lets out a short laugh. "That depends on how people want to hear it." The audience reacts again. At this point, the tone is clearly shifting, still polite, but sharper underneath. Gayle continues. "Do you think Hollywood is too sensitive right now?" Matthew pauses before answering. "I think Hollywood is too reactive." The audience reacts with a louder response. Gayle doesn't let the momentum go. "Reactive to criticism?" "Reactive to everything," Matthew replies. "Criticism, praise, headlines." The room quiets slightly. One co-host whispers something off camera. The mic catches a faint laugh. Gayle leans forward again. "But isn't that part of being in the public eye?" Matthew nods slowly. "Yes. But there's a difference between being in the public eye and being under constant interrogation. That line lands heavily. Audience reaction rises again, mixed applause and murmurs. Gayle holds eye contact. Interrogation is a strong word. Matthew doesn't back off. It's also sometimes accurate. A brief silence follows. The studio atmosphere now feels noticeably more tense than at the beginning. Gayle adjusts her tone slightly. Let me ask you this directly then. Do you feel misunderstood by the media? Matthew takes a second before answering. I think people often hear headlines before they hear context. The audience claps again. Gayle nods slowly, but her expression suggests she's preparing to push further in the next moment. The conversation is no longer just promotional, it has turned into something sharper, more personal, and unpredictable. And the next question is where things are about to shift even further. The studio is still holding that uneasy calm after the last exchange. Cameras stay locked, audience quiets down, and the hosts try to smoothly guide the conversation back, but the energy has already shifted. Matthew McConaughey sits back in his chair, still composed, while Gayle King keeps her eyes on him, ready to continue but clearly more cautious now. Gayle gives a small smile and moves her notes aside. Okay, Matthew, let's bring it back to your new project for a moment. Matthew nods. Sure. She continues. This film explores division, public opinion, and how people respond to pressure. Some people are saying your comments today kind of reflect the same theme in real life. Matthew gives a slight smile. Life usually reflects art, or maybe art reflects life. A few audience members chuckle softly. Gayle leans forward. But do you think you're contributing to that division by how you're speaking about media and criticism? The room shifts slightly again. Matthew pauses before answering. I don't think calling out imbalance creates division. I think ignoring it does. A soft reaction spreads through the audience. Gayle responds quickly, but some people would say the media isn't the problem, it's just a mirror of society. Matthew tilts his head. A mirror can still be distorted. A couple of audience members react with ooh sounds. Gayle smiles tightly. That's a strong way to put it. Matthew nods. I try to be precise. One of the co-hosts interrupts gently, trying to ease tension. Okay, I feel like we're getting into deep waters again. Light laughter from the audience. Gayle keeps her focus steady. Matthew, I want to understand something clearly. When you say outrage culture, what exactly are you referring to? Matthew takes a breath. I'm referring to how quickly people move from understanding a statement to reacting against it. Gayle immediately follows up. But isn't reacting part of engagement? Reacting is, Matthew says, but not always understanding. The audience reacts again, slightly louder. Gayle nods slowly but doesn't let it go. So you think people aren't listening properly? Matthew shakes his head. I think people are listening through filters. The room quiets again. Gayle raises her eyebrows slightly. Filters like what? Like headlines. Like social media clip. Like 10-second interpretations of 2-hour conversations. That line gets a noticeable reaction from the audience. A co-host laughs under their breath. He's not wrong about that part. Gayle smiles briefly, then returns to the pressure. But Matthew, you are also part of that system. You promote films, you do interviews, you participate in the same media cycle. Matthew nods. Absolutely. So how do you separate yourself from it? Matthew leans forward slightly now. I don't separate myself from it. I try to participate honestly within it. The audience quiets again, listening closely. Gayle tilts her head. And you think this interview is honest? Matthew looks at her for a moment, then answers carefully. I think we're both trying. The audience reacts with mixed sounds, some applause, some nervous laughter. Gayle shifts in her seat. That's fair. A brief pause follows. Then she continues, slightly more direct. Because earlier, you said you feel like media frames answers before you even give them. Matthew nods. Sometimes. Gayle points gently with her pen. So right now, do you feel framed? The studio becomes very quiet. Matthew looks around the set for a second, then back at her. Right now I feel like we're having a conversation that's trying to find clarity. Gayle doesn't break eye contact. That didn't answer my question. A small tension rises again in the room. Matthew exhales slowly. Okay, sometimes framing happens in intention, not just words. Audience reacts immediately. One co-host whispers, "This is getting intense again." Gayle leans in slightly. "And what do you think my intention is?" Matthew pauses longer this time. "That you want clarity. But also that clarity can sometimes come with pressure attached to it." A wave of reaction moves through the audience. Gayle responds quickly. "Isn't pressure part of journalism?" Matthew nods. "Yes. But pressure can either reveal truth or reshape it." The room reacts louder again. The tone is now fully serious. Even the earlier lightness is gone. Gayle sits back slightly, absorbing the answer. "So in your view, what would a perfect media conversation look like?" Matthew thinks for a moment. "One where people don't feel like they have to win the exchange." The audience reacts softly. Gayle smiles faintly. "But television is kind of built on winning moments." Matthew nods. "That might be the issue." A brief silence follows, heavier than before. The co-hosts look between them, sensing the conversation is nearing another turning point. Gayle closes her notes slightly. "Well, I don't think anyone here is trying to win, Matthew. But I do think people are trying to understand you better." Matthew looks at her calmly. "Then I think we're getting somewhere." The audience gives a light applause as the tension settles just slightly, but the atmosphere remains charged, like everyone is waiting for the next question that could shift everything again. The studio has settled into a tense rhythm now. The earlier smiles are still there, but they don't feel as natural anymore. The audience is quieter, more attentive, like everyone knows each word matters a little more than usual. Matthew McConaughey sits forward slightly now, hands loosely together, while Gayle King maintains steady eye contact, her tone measured but firm as she continues the conversation. Gayle begins carefully. "Matthew, I want to shift slightly, because a lot of people watching this morning are wondering something very simple." Matthew nods. "Okay." She continues, "Do you think celebrities have a responsibility to be careful with their words, knowing how much influence they have?" Matthew doesn't rush. "I think everyone has responsibility with their words, not just celebrities." A few audience members react softly. Gayle follows up immediately. "But celebrities have a bigger platform. So does that make the responsibility bigger?" Matthew leans back slightly. "It might make the reach bigger, but not necessarily the truth bigger." That line gets a noticeable reaction from the audience. Gayle raises her eyebrows slightly. "Explain that." Matthew nods. "Just because more people hear something doesn't mean it becomes more correct. It just becomes louder." A small wave of murmurs moves through the room. One co-host quietly whispers, "That's a good line," under their breath. Gayle keeps her focus. "But you understand why people would say with influence comes accountability." Matthew responds calmly. "I agree with accountability. I just think accountability should be consistent." The audience reacts again, slightly louder this time. Gayle tilts her head. "Consistent in what way?" Matthew pauses for a second. "In how we apply it. Not selectively." The room quiets again. Gayle doesn't let the moment drift. "Are you suggesting media applies it selectively?" Matthew looks at her. "I'm suggesting all systems do, including media, including public opinion." A soft reaction spreads across the audience. Gayle leans forward a bit. "That's a broad statement." Matthew nods. "Because it's a broad issue." A brief silence follows. The tension is still present, but now it's more reflective than aggressive. Gayle shifts slightly in her chair. "Let me ask you something more personal then. Do you ever feel misunderstood in these conversations?" Matthew takes a moment before answering. I think misunderstood is part of communication sometimes. The audience reacts lightly. Gayle presses gently. But does it bother you? Matthew exhales. It depends on the intent behind the misunderstanding. That answer gets a stronger reaction than expected. A co-host looks toward the camera briefly, then back at the table, sensing the energy building again. Gayle continues, "What do you mean by intent?" Matthew looks down for a second, then back up. Some misunderstandings come from lack of context. Others come from choosing not to include context. The audience reacts immediately with mixed sound. Gayle responds quickly. And you think you're experiencing the second one? Matthew doesn't hesitate. Sometimes, yes. A slight shift happens in the room again. The audience leans in. Gayle's tone becomes more focused. That's a serious claim. Matthew nods. It's a serious environment. A pause. One of the co-hosts tries to ease it again. Okay, I feel like we're all very awake now this morning. Soft laughter breaks the tension for a second, but it fades quickly. Gayle looks at Matthew. Do you think interviews like this help or hurt that situation? Matthew answers honestly. Both. Depends on how it's framed later. The audience reacts again. Gayle smiles slightly, but it's controlled. We can't control how things are framed after they air. Matthew nods. Exactly. That simple agreement creates a brief moment of calm. Gayle continues. So what would you want viewers to take away from moments like this? Matthew thinks for a second. That disagreement doesn't mean disrespect. The audience reacts warmly to that line. Gayle nods slowly. That's fair. A short pause follows, but the energy is still tight beneath the surface. Then Gayle changes direction slightly again. Because earlier you said people are reacting too quickly. But isn't it also true that sometimes silence can be taken as agreement? Matthew looks at her. Yes. Silence can be misunderstood too. Gayle immediately responds. So what's the balance then? Matthew leans forward slightly again. Conversation. Not reaction. Not silence. Conversation. The audience reacts softly again. A co-host nods along. Okay, that sounds reasonable. But Gayle doesn't fully release the pressure. Conversation also includes challenging each other though, she says. Matthew nods. It does. But challenging shouldn't feel like cornering. That line changes the room again. A few audience members react loudly. Gayle pauses for a second, then responds. Do you feel cornered right now? The studio goes quiet. Matthew looks at her, then at the audience briefly, then back. I feel like I'm being asked to explain myself in real time, which is fine. That's what this is. A beat. Then he adds, but yes, sometimes that can feel like pressure. The audience reacts immediately. The co-hosts glance at each other, sensing the conversation nearing another peak. Gayle nods slowly, absorbing the honesty. I appreciate you saying that. Matthew nods back. I appreciate you asking. For a moment, the tension doesn't disappear, but it softens just enough that the audience feels the shift. The conversation is still live, still unpredictable, and still sitting right on the edge of calm and confrontation as the segment moves forward. The atmosphere in the studio feels different now. The earlier tension hasn't fully disappeared, but it has settled into something quieter, more controlled. The audience is attentive, almost careful with their reactions. Matthew McConaughey sits back slightly in his chair, hands relaxed, while Gayle King takes a breath and shifts the tone of the conversation toward closure, though everyone can still feel the weight of what was discussed. Gayle begins softly. Matthew, I want to end this conversation on something clearer for our viewers. Matthew nods. Okay. She continues. Despite the back and forth today, do you still believe dialogue like this is important? Matthew answers without hesitation. Yeah. Especially conversations like this. The audience reacts lightly, a few nods and soft applause. Gayle smiles faintly. Even when it gets uncomfortable? Matthew gives a small half-smile. Especially when it gets uncomfortable. That line draws a stronger reaction from the audience. A co-host nods. That's real. Gayle continues, because I think people at home saw moments of tension, but also moments of honesty. Matthew nods. I think both can exist at the same time. Gayle leans forward slightly. Do you think we understood each other better by the end of this? Matthew pauses, then replies. I think we understood the conversation better. Understanding each other is a longer process. The audience reacts softly again. There's a brief silence, but it's no longer tense, it's reflective. Gayle shifts her tone toward wrapping up. I do want to say, I appreciate you staying present with every question today. Matthew looks at her. I appreciate you not avoiding the hard ones. A small reaction from the audience follows that exchange. One co-host smiles. Okay, that felt like growth right there. Light laughter spreads through the studio. Gayle turns slightly toward the audience. Because sometimes what you see on television is two people disagreeing, but what's actually happening is two people trying to understand different perspectives. Matthew nods. That's exactly it. The audience claps softly. But the segment isn't fully closed yet. There's still a final reflection hanging in the air. Gayle asks one last question. If you could say one thing to people who watched this and formed their own opinions about you today, what would it be? Matthew takes a moment. The studio goes quiet again. Then he speaks calmly. I'd say don't rush to conclusions about anyone from a few minutes of conversation. Not me, not anyone. That line gets a strong audience reaction. Applause and agreement sounds. Gayle nods. That's fair. Matthew adds, and I'd say the same thing about me. I'm still figuring things out like everybody else. The tone softens noticeably. A co-host leans in. That's probably the most honest thing said all morning. Laughter spreads again, this time more natural. Gayle smiles and closes her note. Well, Matthew McConaughey, we appreciate you coming in and having this conversation with us, even when it got real. Matthew smiles. It's always real here. The audience applauds more warmly now, the earlier tension finally easing out of the room. But as the applause continues, the reaction outside the studio begins building quickly. Clips of the exchange start circulating online almost immediately. Social media platforms light up with divided opinions, some praising Matthew for being direct, others saying the conversation showed unnecessary friction between guest and host. Comments begin trending around both names, and short clips of key moments get reposted with different interpretations depending on who shares them. Inside the studio, the hosts begin wrapping up the segment, but the energy lingers. Some audience members are still talking quietly among themselves about what they just witnessed. The co-hosts exchange glances, acknowledging that this wasn't just another routine interview, it was one of those moments that will be replayed, analyzed, and debated later in the day. After the show, producers discuss how the segment unfolded, noting how quickly a simple promotional interview shifted into a deeper discussion about media, accountability, and perception. No one describes it as a fight, but everyone agrees it had intensity that audiences clearly felt. Outside the studio, early social media reactions start splitting into two clear sides, some calling it one of the most refreshingly honest talk show moments in recent memory, others arguing it showed unnecessary tension between guest and host. Short clips of the exchange begin circulating rapidly, especially the moments where both voices overlapped in disagreement. By the end of the day, the conversation is no longer just about the film Matthew came to promote. It has become a broader discussion about interviews, media framing, and how public conversations unfold on live television. And as viewers continue debating what they saw, one thing is clear. This wasn't just another talk show appearance. It was a moment people will keep replaying and reinterpreting long after the cameras stopped rolling. Now the only question left for viewers is simple. Share their opinion in the comments and subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.